Okay, we are back in the book of Esther. It's been a few weeks here, so I want us to kind of get reacquainted with what we're doing, to remember where this is placed and its value because of that, of what's going on. What we've seen it's in Persia, and the chronology is that Cyrus, king of Persia, ultimately overthrew Babylon after he had kind of consolidated his power within Persia, and in 539 or thereabouts, he was able to overcome Babylon. He then subsequently, in some time, frees the Jews and allows them to go back to their homeland. That is followed by a series of Cambyses, who was very much against that program and that caused problems, or at least due to the politics. A brief reign of a pseudo-Smyrnus, but then under Darius, that's when the Jews were allowed to rebuild the temple, finish rebuilding that process during his reign. He was very successful, except ultimately in the Battle of Marathon, and that loss to the Greeks, as he kept expanding, that loss was significant, and it plays into his son's attitude, who is Xerxes, or as we see here in Esther, depending upon how, I've pronounced it multiple ways. It depends on whether or not you're trying to get all the vowels in from Hebrew. But in a sense, it really is Xerxes, right? That's it. And you get all of that together and you just kind of smush it. Or we could pretend it's French and ignore the vowels, and we'd be fine. So nobody does French here. Okay. Well, so I was referring to Xerxes. That's who follows him in 486. Okay. He tries then to go back, we covered this, and goes back to kind of avenge the honor and make good on that promise to defeat the Greeks, but he's ultimately defeated. Now, after this, notice the time frame, he comes on at 486. Now, when we get down, he's going to go out at 465. That's a different story. But it's during his reign that Esther occurs. Okay? So what we saw in chapter 1 was one time frame that was before the war that he went in. And then ultimately he comes back, and that's where you have chapter 2 occur. Now, that's important because now we're going to get down to chapter 3 is going to be a few years later. But the key idea here is that once you get here into chapter 3, all the events from chapter 3 to the rest of the book occur within a year. So all of this has been preliminary. That's kind of one of the important things, that we were in exposition of the overall telling of the story. You needed to know about the planning. You needed to know about the expulsion of Queen. And then you needed to know about the new one coming in and her background. And you needed to know about Mordecai and his actions. All of those, but that has been some years removed. Okay, that's what we're going to see, is we've got about 4 years removed from all that at least. And we see that from chapter 3 and verse 7. So with all of that going on then, here's what we're dealing with. They are in Susa, which is over here on the far, almost on the far right. Persepolis is being built probably, and it is further down. But Susa is just to the east of Babylon, old city of Ur to its southwest. And so that's kind of where that is, right in that normal place that we think of as so many things happening. And this is an example of what that would have been like. So what we find then, the background of Esther 3, is that Esther's been crowned, and that happened in the 7th year of the reign. Okay? So if he came on in about 486, then that means that this is 479. But then we come down to chapter 3 and verse 7, and it says, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Okay, so the 12th year. So sometime, if we come through and you've got that, the 7th year, now we're in the 12th, where we've got 4 to 5 years having passed in that, how they figure the times, which puts this occurring around 474 BC. Okay, approximately. And Haman was promoted sometime in between this, and probably, I'll say early on, with the events likely due to, it's hard to tell, but I want you to think about what's going on. This was a costly campaign that he went on to Greece. He lost. So that it was all expense. So when you come back, there's this need. There's not a whole lot, there's not the money the same. There's a loss of face. And so there's that going on in terms of the way in which the king would be thinking. But it also was a few years after that still. Okay, so you've got around 5 years. Where are we now? Haman, whether or not he grew up and gained original favor as a result of that campaign, that he moved up, or often what happens, you end up moving up the ranks and solidifying your place because a lot of the guys that are considered the reasons why you lost, kind of lose favor, and if that's all they lose. So you end up with that problem. But we aren't told that exactly. But as we begin then to look at the text itself, we're going to note certain things about, in comparison, about how he's presented. And again, the key thing, what I'm trying to do is show you the literary way in which the Bible presents this for the full effect of the big idea about what this book is about. So what I see here then is, I call this the monster rises, because you finally get, after the exposition of the first 2 chapters, that is the background material setting the scene, you now get the conflict introduced of what this is all about. And with that in mind, then you have Haman introduced as being this problem. And when I see this lay out, the overall of this chapter lays out in verses 1 through 6, which is essentially, here's what produced the conflict. Okay, here's the background to the conflict. The conflict doesn't actually begin here specifically, because it begins as a personal matter between Haman and Mordecai, which we'll talk about in a moment. So then, after having done that, Haman goes on to play the politics in his newfound position, his strength of position next to the king, to use that position in order to get what amounts to now a genocide approved, right, because of a personal affront. Now, this guy's a real winner, right? You go from personal affront to let's have a genocide. So that's what he does. And the king goes along with it. That's the climax of this story. Because now, okay, it was all Haman's idea, but now it's in motion. And then in verses 12 through 15, you have all the fallout, which is, okay, well, if this is going to go forth, all the things you have to do as a government to implement that decision. And then at the end of the chapter, you're going to end up with everyone trying to figure out, what's going on? What just happened here in our country? Okay, that's how this ends. So you start with Haman being raised in profile, and you end up, because of his arrogance and his personal pride being affronted, you end up with a nation, an empire, that is now committed to a genocide, and no one knows why, including the king. Did you get that? All right. That's one of the things of how this is laid out that we want to try to notice here. So as you look at the main people that are involved is the king, who is Xerxes, he is the ruler, and so you have to think, okay, that's likely what's going on, that he's out of touch. And that's one way to look at this. The other is he's played for the fool in this whole thing because he approves something and he doesn't even know what he's just approved. Haman is the seducer, I would argue, and because he is seducing, in this sense, the king to accept his designs. He's got this, he could be a trickster, but I think he's more than that. I think it's more a seducer in that end. Whereas Mordecai, because he's the one that defied the original order, is presented as a rebel. And so you've got everyone else trying to figure out what's going on. And you're going to find early on the people saying, why aren't you bowing down? Everyone's supposed to bow down. You're not bowing down. So they're like, that's not fair. Okay, so that's kind of the role they're playing in all this. So let's go ahead and take a look and read through this, and we'll note then how to understand and what is being done as a process. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. All right, so we go through and we look then at what has been laid out, because this is all the information that leads to this conflict. And so I wanted to kind of lay out and notice, because of the general theme of Esther, which has to do with just providence, but we need to lead up and understand how that works, and to appreciate all these things that kind of played into it. So if you want to, you ever, people come up and they want to know why. When some bad things happen, people a lot of times want to know why. And I want you to notice that in this thing that was decided, which is a genocide against the Jews, all the different factors that had to play into this. Okay? The first is what we found in Haman's promotion, that he was promoted in if you read up on this at all, he is the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. And a lot of times people bring up the fact that he was the Agagite, and that is somehow related to Agag the king that Saul slew, and therefore if there's some connection between Saul's house and Mordecai's house, that this was a personal vendetta based upon something that happened about 500 years before. I find that very difficult to believe, that you've got that going on, but some have promoted that. The key idea instead is that he had advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all that is that the princes are simply all the influential advisors, everyone that goes with him. And he has the top spot among all the top influencers within the empire. Now that's where he is now. We were introduced to this group originally in chapter 1. With regard to going to war and what their advice was in addressing the problem of Vashti. Well, now he's at the top. Now, what I want you to know, just in a purely kind of literary way to appreciate this, how is Esther, when we saw in chapter 2, how was she introduced? Her story was one of rise from obscurity. We don't know anything about Haman's background, but when he comes on the scene, he is already at the very top. Outside of the king, he's at the top. So what you have in this sense is an automatic, because they are put back to back, and he is the one that's the antagonist, the one who is driving the motion negatively throughout the account. But their stories collide because they're coming from such different places. And that's going to be important to appreciate the nature of the conflict, who he thinks he is, okay? And he acts like he's the top dog all the time. And that idea is driving much of this from this original promotion, and that you've got someone who is certainly then has, shall we say, aspirations, if you're going to move up this ladder, who thinks of himself in this way, and if everybody does not go along with this, that's not good enough for him either. Everyone has to acknowledge who he is. That's the driving thing behind this. What we find in verse 2 then is that all these king's servants, okay, that were within the king's gate. Now notice how the king's gate is this important barrier to Susa. We saw that with where Mordecai was, and that kind of that circle of you're within that outer gate that represented access in some way to the world of the palace. Okay? Well, we have with the king, he's going along with all of this. So they're having him bow down and paying homage to Haman. Okay, now that you have both the idea of bowing down, so we have to figure out where's the conflict. You have to bow down. Now, where does that present a problem if you're going to bow? What are you saying when you bow? Okay, yes, but it also depends. You know, for example, at Wimbledon, when the tennis players bow before the royalty, I don't think they're worshiping them. But yet, that nature is tied originally to this idea. That's still true. It's just that the connotation has changed. David? They were somewhat. They had, you're going to get to pull out some real out there kind of stuff. They had this concept of fravashi, which is the ultimate idea that became the spirit of Ish. It's not exact translation, but the idea of the spirit, and that led to what was adopted by the Greeks in terms of hero cult, which was then emperor cult. So there is actually a direct line you can trace from Persian cult to hero cult in the Greeks to emperor cult in the Roman Empire. Lily Ross Taylor did some good work with a book on that. So you have yes, Brock.
How often would it be someone at Haman's level would get kind of bowing?
I'm not sure that is any way we would know, unless it just happens to be recorded in history. And that kind of thing is rarely going to be recorded because the ancient history were recorded clearly with a focus on the kings. And unless that person was successful or ultimately appears as a very unsuccessful takeover, that's usually why you would hear about it. So you would not hear about just someone being honored in different ways within their literature, because number one, how they had to record that literature, it was usually on a steel. You're dealing with some carving usually. Either it could be on you have the Cyrus cylinder, or you could have a steel, something that would be set up, and they'd be writing around it. It takes a lot so that they would not be, those were designed to honor kings. And so you're not going to usually get the other recorded, which is part of our problem, so I can't really answer your question. So the king, though, is going along with all of this, and again, you're paying homage. Well, what does that really mean? You're acknowledging he's your superior. That's the very least. Now, there is likely some idea here of, because of that there is, going back to David's question, some idea of, in a connotation at least for a Jew, that you're doing more than that. That you're somehow acknowledging that there's some kind of divine connection or God connection here, which is the reason why he would not want to do this. And I base that on the fact that when the explanation is given by the people, but when it says Mordecai would not bow or pay homage, and they're asking him, why? Verse 3, why do you transgress the king's command? Why are you so against doing this? And their takeaway from all of this was, ultimately, that he told them that he was a Jew. So the tie-in in terms of as far as explanation is, I'm not going to do that because I'm a Jew. And because I'm a Jew, you say, well, what's the big deal there? If you're monotheistic and the nature of that's being asked of you is in some way related to what you do to a god, if you are polytheistic, all you would be doing would be adding one more guy into your group, okay? You just join the club, that's fine. More the merrier. Okay? Polytheism, you just have as many as you can possibly get, and they can fight it out for who's important. We're just going to lump them all together. In monotheism, though, this is exclusive. And so the whole idea is we're not letting anybody in, and that's where David's question about why this friction is there, because the idea of bowing and doing homage has some idea of tying in with something religious. And therefore, his rejection of it, Mordecai's rejection of it, is, from the text, most likely is tied to his Jewishness. Now, the other reason why I would argue that's what's going on is because of the theme that is presented in the literature during this period that fell along with, say, what Daniel was writing, which was standing up against a foreign power's push to have you conform spiritually. Okay, and that continued to be a challenge. I'm writing something up right now through all of Hellenism, that was an issue. Okay, so you've got that problem. Now, we already mentioned this, but Mordecai's refusal is here. So all of these things that happened, okay, the promotion, this wouldn't have happened if Haman hadn't been promoted. It would not have happened if the king had any sense about what he let his underlings do. That would not have happened. If Mordecai hadn't refused, this wouldn't have happened. The servants had kept their mouths shut, this wouldn't have happened. Okay. Now, did you notice something, though, when it says, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew? Did that strike your ear as interesting in any way compared to what we saw in chapter 2? I know it's been a few weeks. What had Mordecai specifically told Esther? Don't tell anybody you're a Jew. Right? Isn't it fascinating that here in chapter 2, he's saying, you need to keep quiet about who you are, but here, that is front and center from the very beginning. Why? Why would he tell Esther to be quiet while he himself, at the first opportunity presented, tell everybody, or at least the people in his circle?
Esther didn't have to say who she was. She could be quiet about that. But he was challenged, and I think he saw himself being challenged in his faith and who he is.
Okay.
So he had to stand up.
Yeah, I agree, Sandra. The difference is that was not required, and there was no official challenge to it, and he knew that would be looked on as a negative, and because of the situation with her already be pulled in to basically being queen or harem, that do your best, okay, and don't bring this up. Whereas for him, the challenge was already there. That's going to be important because, of course, when he had her keep quiet, that there will be a big reveal. But it's because of the challenge and that connection there, and that's how the story, and because of this difference between the two, draws attention to it and makes that a bigger deal. Her identity is still quiet. Mordecai's is well known. Now, so the servants are checking in on all this, and then you get to verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. So we got the next problem is Haman's character. Okay? But then verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai, he was a Jew. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. Okay, this tells you that the nature of the problem for what he saw was not just a Mordecai problem, but if Mordecai was basing his refusal on being a Jew, then all other Jews would have a similar problem with him, and he couldn't handle that. So all of them got to go. Okay, I just wanted you to understand how this works. And notice, you talk about that, how something can escalate. You went from being promoted and getting honored. This is a key theme, is we're going to watch how he responds to being honored. He gets honored, and the next thing you do, you know, he's lashing out at somebody because it's not good enough. There is no honor that is good enough for this man if everybody doesn't honor him. That's one of the things I want you to see from the very beginning of how he's being presented. Okay. So now we move into the rising action in verses 7 through 9. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot. Now, they bring that up because that's going to be important later on, the naming of it. Before Haman to determine the day and the month, until it fell in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it please the king, let a decree be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries. You know, this was an audacious man with an audacious plan. Okay. Isn't it interesting? What do you learn, though, from the fact that it was the first month, the month of Nisan, in that 12th year, that they're casting this lot, and they determine the day and the month of what? Of killing them. So they're casting lots to decide what's the right time. Now, that tells you a little bit about the Persian background, Persian superstition, religion. That's not unusual at all. You'll have our ideas when you hear people talk about omens, that comes back from ancient times. You could have, everyone heard about haruspices? No, that's an odd, that comes down more from Romans. Yeah, there we go. Just think about, okay, the idea that you're going to decide whether or not to go to war based upon killing a chicken and checking out its innards. Okay? That's, okay, I just described what it is. Okay? They kind of used that, and they had diviners to try to tell the difference. And all of these are, the idea is we want to please our gods. We want to make sure we're in line with it. Okay? So there's a religious aspect to it. And remember, it is on the basis of these are people who are not going along and are outside of our culture. So there's definitely a culture issue going on. So notice how he approaches the king, though, in that it's all, he turns it around. You recognize verses 1 through 6 that it's really all about him. But then what does he do in verses 7 through 9? If you just read 7 through 9, would you ever think that? Now he makes it all about the king, doesn't he? Now he knows how to play it. He's going to turn it around, and the problem is there's certain people. He doesn't even want to tell the king who it is in case the king has a soft spot in his heart. So he's not going to even reveal that much. Their laws are different. That's a key element. That is, here are, number one, we got major cultural differences. Now remember, within Persia, and you know this from Cyrus letting the Jews go back, is that their philosophy as an empire was actually letting people self-rule to some degree, so long as they paid their tribute and didn't do anything to stir up trouble, then that was fine. So the idea of that their laws are different is that there's some problem with their laws. And that specifically then, he kind of is leading into that, they do not keep the king's laws. So there is this big conflict. The whole idea was you can do this as long as you're not in some way opposed to the king's laws. And so that's where he lays it out there. But theirs are against the king's laws. Well, what king's law were they against? Honoring Haman. That was it. Okay? So as a result of this, the argument goes that it's not fitting for them to remain. Now you notice how it's framed. It is framed that they are essentially a rebellious people who they're within the empire. They have their own system of rule, and this is completely against what the king wants done. So they have their own little unit operating that is counter to the laws that exist, and therefore they need to be taken care of. Y'all pay attention to the news? This is essentially like setting up Sharia law within a democracy kind of idea that defies any of those laws. We're going to operate on our own system. That's what they're being accused of, just so you understand the idea. And so the answer is wipe them out. Genocide. So write a decree. Decrees are important in this book. Write a decree that they be destroyed. And now here we go. I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. Now that's kind of been confusing. How are you going to both? Because later on when the king says it, he says, no, we'll pay it out this way. So some look at this as just being kind of a way in which they would word things to say, I'll make sure it doesn't cost you that much, king. But it does speak to the money problem that they had during this time. So you've got a situation where all of this is going to occur within a 1-year time frame. That's important. Isn't it interesting that the lot fell on the farthest time possible? From the first month to the 12th month. And that this corresponded to just before Passover, which was about God's deliverance. Okay? So you have Haman took this personal affront and he turned that into a kingly offense. What's interesting is was the king in any way upset about this before? He didn't even know about it. And after Haman tells him, there's not really a whole lot of evidence that he's that upset afterwards either. Okay. So what you get when you pair the way in which this is presented of a picture of this king is he's definitely the ruler that is out of touch. He really doesn't understand what all is going on for whatever reason. So Haman offers a solution. We'll just take them all out. I'll handle it all. You don't have to worry about it. So now, this personal offense, he gets to be in control of. All he needs is the king's approval and the king's seal. That's all he needs. So that leads us to the climax of the story, which is found in verses 10 and 11. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. So it's decided. That's why this is the climax. The decision's been made. The king bought it, and you give the signet ring, you fill out all the details. Here you go. Now this is going to come back. I want you to remember this because this action of how he works with this, all of this is going to come back later on. So keep this in mind. But I do want to draw your attention to a word here in verse 11, just a moment. What we have in all of this, that's in this climax, is he is setting us up for poetic justice, and there's going to be this great evidence of literary symmetry because of how this decision was made. The idea of the heritage, okay, there's a literary hint of motivation about what's going on. We're not sure exactly. But what you learn about the king here, I told you the meaning is a little bit debated. But no matter what, it shows that he's really not taking all this that seriously. And it's just kind of, okay, whatever. And so you get someone idea that is a little bit he's out of touch, unaware, and he's happy to let other people do the hard decisions. That's what you get, is that he's got these people, as long as things are going fine, they can do what they can kind of work this how they want. But this last point, Did you notice that wording? How in any way can you describe this plan as being good? Just in any way. That sounds good. There's a layer of irony to that. That when you look down at the text in verse 11, to do with them as seems good to you. Now, the way that we tend to look at good as what we want rather than being something that has moral standing. Okay, so what do you have to do? If that's the decision, what has to happen? This is, when we come to these kind of passages, sometimes we become throwaway, we don't think about them that much. But there's a reason why, and that goes back even to chapter 1. They serve an important literary purpose. And whenever something serves a literary purpose, it helps bind things together in terms of the overall form of the book that ends up highlighting the meaning. That's why we're studying it this way. It says, then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. Does anyone know when that would have fallen? For a Jewish calendar? And a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded. Not that the king, that Haman commanded. To the king's satraps, okay, those are the higher ups, right? To the governors who were over each province. So you kind of had satraps, and then they broke down into many kind of provinces, and that's what you had the governors over. To the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. So what is this just communicated? We're making sure everyone knows. All we're doing is we're just filtering down this decree from Haman to the satraps, which is the next level down. You'd have the princes, essentially, the satraps, to the next level down to the governors, to the next layer down to all the officials. And that was designed to go in that fashion, so it covered all 127 provinces. And that meant, because of the nature of the Persian Empire, it had to go out in the different languages as well. So it had to be translated. In the name of King Ahasuerus, it was written, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Now, did you notice something right here? What just happened between how it began and how it ended? It's what Haman commanded in the name of the king. So it's got the king's backing, but it was really Haman's command because it's his play. But it's been sealed. And what we're going to find is if it's been sealed in a Persian context, you've been sealed with the king's signet ring, it doesn't change. That's how it is. And the letters were sent by couriers. This also matters because it's going to be repeated. Into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. All the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. How are we going to make up all this money? Genocides usually have other purposes. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. Can you imagine preparing yourself for a genocide? Just the order comes down, get ready, because on this day, we're just going to kill all these people. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was published, or proclaimed rather, in Shushan, the citadel. All right, so we've got it out. The couriers are going out. Now notice the thing that's going out is you have the decision made, you have the signet ring stamped as it's written out. That is then sent out and published throughout all the different layers, and then couriers are going off with it to make sure it is made known throughout the empire. This is going to be repeated later, and it forms an important kind of way of structure of the book. And then it's proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So once we've got it all out and we send the couriers out, okay, now we send what essentially would be the heralds out into the streets. Here you go, Shushan, here's what the new law is. So you've got an edict has been decided, written and sealed in verse 12. The letters are sent out to officials throughout the empire in verse 13. Copies are distributed to the people in verse 14. Notice the layering. And now there's a command proclaimed officially in the capital. So now it's done deal. That's where we are. All of that had to happen once the king made the decision. So that's why it's falling action. So here we come to the end of the chapter in the denouement, at the end of verse 15. So the king and Haman sat down to drink. Now, do you remember when I told you back before that you're going to see some form of banqueting was involved with decision making? Originally, they were, in chapter 1, they are at a big banquet, and there's this decision that's made at the banquet. Here, we've made a decision, then we kind of have a form of a banquet. But the whole idea of okay, that's done, let's have a drink. So, king and Haman sat down to drink. But here's where the denouement comes in. But the city of Shushan was perplexed. What's happening? And this tells you something that, from the point of view of just anybody looking around, that they could never find any in their interactions a reason why any of this would just happen. It's just out of the blue. Going to kill some Jews at the end of the year. All the Jews. Why? They've been living side by side throughout the empire without any issues. Until Haman has an issue. And Haman only has an issue because of his own pride. But the point is, it doesn't matter why. You still have to deal with outcomes regardless of all the whys involved. So we could go through and we noted there are a lot of reasons why. A lot of things just fell into place in the wrong way. That's actually interesting itself. Bad decisions is understanding here, they're confused. They had a right to be confused. And this is telling you, you ought to be confused too, because there's no logical reason why this would happen. And how are we going to get out of it? And that's the point. We'll pick up there next week.